All of these parts came out of that Sachs Torpedo hub or wheel that I took apart in a previous video. I cleaned them, I inspected them, and I think they should still work. And now it is time to reassemble all of this. And I did not take apart these sub-assemblies because I didn't see a reason for doing that. The chance of me losing stuff was just too big. Alright, let's start with this axle. I believe this axle is the most heavily worn part of this 3-speed torpedo, especially around this area, and that is where the spring sits, the spring and this little cap that sits on top of the spring. I don't think this spring and cap are rotating or turning, so I have no idea if all of this wear matters. Around this area there is also a whole lot of wear, and that is where the planetary cage sits. You see, quite a bit of wear. Not sure if this is going to be a problem. The gears all still look perfectly usable, and the same is true for the pawls, although you can see some bright spots on the tips of the pawls, but I expect these will still work. And for your information, these pawls here are for the first gear. Now I'm going to take this off, and for lubrication I'm going to use some oil. Gearbox oil from a car. And I've just decided that I'm also going to use a little bit of grease. No more. I think this will be enough. Now I'm going to paint some oil on this planetary gear assembly, trying to get some on the little axles. This might be more for rust prevention than for lubrication. I think that's enough oil. Let's install this thing. Also some oil on the pawls, and plenty of oil on the axle. You know what? I'm also going to use just a little bit of grease. I have it, so why not use it? I don't want this thing to rust. So next I got this washer with a flat side, so it can only fit on one position on the axle. Next I got this E-clip to keep everything in place. And this is not original. The original C-clip I accidentally launched somewhere in the barn here, and so far I have not been able to find it again. Alright, now I need to flip the axle so I can work on the other side with the next parts. Up next is this ring gear, and that will slip over the planetary cage. But first I'm going to coat this with some oil. I think that's enough oil to prevent the ring gear from rusting. And just like the other gears, I'm also going to use a tiny amount of grease. Okay, now I need to paint some oil on the pawls here, and I'm definitely not going to use grease on the pawls, because that idea kind of backfired when I reassembled a Sturmey Archer hub years ago. It's a bit of a greasy job. So next I'm going to install this little piece that sits in the center of the axle, and that's where the indicator pin screws into. And I can slide this through the hole in the clutch here, that hole. This is a bit simpler than this design is a bit simpler than a Sturmey Archer. Okay. Next I got this spring that pushes down on the ring gear. And let's also install the smaller spring. So next is this driver that sits on top of this spring, and it has splines that fit over the splines on the clutch, like so. And of course I'm also going to paint the driver with some oil to prevent rust. In this driver sits this cage with ball bearings, and that's the bigger cage of the two cages with ball bearings. Actually there are three, the other one sits below the driver. Let's install that one as well. It goes here, and then on top of that the driver. Now originally there is this metal cap that sits on top of the spring, and that is a rather awkward design. It gets pushed through the cage with ball bearings, and it's kind of awkward to assemble. So I'm deviating from the original setup. So this here is the original cone that would sit on top of this little cap, and then the cap would sit on top of the spring. But installing this is very difficult. And I noticed that the Sram T3 hub uses a different cone that basically has a integrated cap, so this will be a lot easier to install. Now this cone is not perfect anymore, and I tried to buy a new one, but yeah, not a whole lot of bicycle stores still sell stuff for this this 3-speed hub. Now this cone doesn't have any thread, so it will get pushed down to a shoulder on the axle, and that is where it is going to sit, like so. I noticed that it is kind of hard to line these ball bearings up with the cone. For some reason they do not want to sit nicely concentric around this cone. Maybe when I have reassembled everything it will be okay, but it is kind of difficult. So next I got this log washer. Let's spin this down. Of course I will also have to use some grease, but I will do that later in the video. Yeah, there it is. Now it sits nicely on the cone. I noticed there's a bit of a rust spot around this area in the drum brake. Most of the rest of the circumference feels pretty smooth, but there are some grooves around here. Not sure what I can do about this. It's not like I can stick this into a lathe. Certainly not with the spokes installed. So the best thing I can do is just remove the rust with a piece of sandpaper and hope for the best. You can definitely see some high spots after I did a little bit of sanding. I am a bit worried that this rust spot will grab the drum brake lining, but I guess we will see how this is going to work out once I have reassembled everything and installed into the frame. After working the drum brake with a piece of sandpaper for maybe 10 minutes, it already looks and feels better, but there are definitely some grooves. Hopefully this will all work out fine. So now I'm going to install the ball bearings on this drum brake side. A little bit of grease. And here's the cage with the ball bearings. It's the smaller one of the two. So on top of all of this grease goes this dust cover. And it is somewhat dented when I disassembled it. And I might dent it a little bit more when assembling. Well, I think I got it, but installing these little dust covers and removing these little dust covers can be a bit of a nightmare. And I'm not really sure which side should be up. I think the other way around they will be stronger when prying this off. So before I install this into the hub, I'm going to remove the driver, the springs and the cages with ball bearings, because I still need to put some grease on this. Before I install the cartridge, I'm going to paint the insides of the hub shell with some oil. Good for preventing rust. Not too much, because then it will probably come out through the bearings. The insides of this hub are from steel, not from aluminium. And this here is the non-drive side cone. It's not a new one, but as far as I can tell, it is still good. And the ball bearings are also not new. And I don't believe that large E-clip that I installed is going to be a problem. It is not coming in contact with the ball bearings. So I turned around the wheel, and now I'm going to install the driver without the springs, so I can do some bench testing. The large cage with ball bearings, the driver, and the small cage with ball bearings that sits inside the driver. And now the cone and a lock nut. Now it's probably going to be difficult to get the cone inside the the cage with ball bearings. For some reason it just doesn't want to do that. I managed to damage this cage with ball bearings when trying to install it. For some reason it's hard to get this cone to sit between the ball bearings. Perhaps it will be easier if I put this as an assembly onto the hub. So I'm going to try and bend this back into shape, and then I will try again to reassemble all this. Let's try and slip this part over the axle without damaging anything. So I managed to install the driver without damaging anything, and the cage with ball bearings is sitting nicely concentric with the cone. But now this large cage with ball bearings is giving me a hard time. So I will take this all apart again and try again. Now the cone is not between the ball bearings. Man, this is so much easier with a Sturmey Archer hub. Well, I'll try again, but I'm not going to try and film this. Hey, did I just get lucky? Well, not with a cone, but the large cage with ball bearings is now sitting perfect. Go down. Yeah, that worked. Now we'll quickly install this lock nut, and then I can do some bench testing. Finally. It's a bit tight, but it's probably good enough for trying to bench test this thing. So I backed off the adjustable cone, that's the cone on the drum brake side, and now the wheel is turning a lot nicer. Next I need to install this little chain or indicator pin. I don't know the proper name for this German part, but I find this chain more difficult to install than a chain from a Sturmey Archer. Without any springs, the hub should now be in third gear. I marked 3 spots on the hub shell that line up with these notches on the driver. Hopefully you can see them in the video. I said that this hub should now be in third gear, so these marks that I scribed onto the hub shell should outrun the driver. And they are. So third gear is good. Now I'm going to pull up on the indicator pin, or this little chain, and now the hub should be in direct drive. I'm going to get a glue clamp to keep this chain in place. In direct drive, the driver should turn at the same rate as the hub shell, and it does. So second gear is working. So let's pull a little bit more on the chain, and that moves the whole ring gear up, and the pawls for second gear and third gear will no longer be in contact with a ratchet inside the hub. And when I turn the driver, it is now outrunning the hub shell, and it does. So first gear is also good. Now I need to take this all apart again so I can apply some grease. It's going to be a messy struggle, I can tell you that. I packed the cages with balls with some grease, and I'm not going to apply any more. This should be enough. And that goes onto the driver. And now I'm going to hammer in this dust cover. And after I've done that, I will try and get the cone to sit between the balls. And this should go on top of the large cage with ball bearings, and then I can try and install this complete with the springs. Everything has been greased up and the little spring has been installed. Now let's try and drop this in place. And this is the first take, so I'm hoping for the best here. The spring is pushing the cone up, and the driver is not sitting correctly on the big cage with ball bearings. I'm going to install a lock nut so I can remove my fingers. If I remove my the small cage is still sitting okay. Now I need to try and see if I can get the driver to sit correctly on top of that large cage with ball bearings. Very difficult. Very frustrating job. And because of this dust cover, I can no longer see the small cage with ball bearings. So it feels okay, but I'm not sure. I think I got it. Thank God. This struggle is over. It's binding up. Why and where? It's not spinning correctly. Maybe I need to back off the adjustable cone on the other side, just a hair. This adjustable cone was definitely set too tight. I'm not sure why this wasn't a problem when I was bench testing. I think that's good. So next there's this washer that sits on top of the cone, and here's the drum brake lining. I cleaned this under the faucet in the kitchen sink. Some people didn't like that, but I think it worked out great. Looks like the drum brake is still working fine, but yeah, bench testing and testing in real life, they are two completely different animals. So next I got this weird looking washer that fits over the cone, and it's for adjusting the cone from the outside of this drum brake. And there's probably a special spanner for this, but yeah, you can also turn it a little with an old screwdriver and a hammer. I think this drum brake should sit lower because the gap here is a bit wide. Why is it not going down? There definitely was a washer here, but let's try it without one. That sits a lot lower now. So why is that washer being difficult? So I just installed the drum brake lining without this washer on the top of the cone, and the drum brake sits a lot lower now, but it is also binding up. You can see that this weird washer and that other washer on top of that one, they are both spinning, and that isn't correct, because they will adjust the cone. So I'm going to try again, this time with this washer. Maybe the drum brake was sitting a little higher when I took it apart. Alright, let's try this again. This time with this washer that fits over the cone. And I'm not completely sure that this is the correct washer. But yeah, it does fit nicely over the cone. Now the drum brake lining. And that weird washer for adjusting the cone. And this is where this gets confusing, because this washer sits a little higher than the cone, but the next washer, this one, it has a small recess that fits over the top of the cone, and with that washer installed, it no longer doesn't fit over the cone, and this is a bit confusing. Also, I do not really like this big gap, but I'm going to install a lock nut and check the result. Hopefully the cone will not move. I think it did move, because there seems to be some drag. Very little, but there is some. Going to loosen this up again and see if I can back off this cone a bit. Nope, still not right. Okay, now I can feel a little bit of play, sideways play on the rim. So let's see if I got it right this time. Man, this vise is too high. This plays too high for me. Also, that COVID injection, or that COVID vaccination, really messed up my left arm. Okay, I think I got it. It's very little sideways play, but still I find this gap too big, so I'm a bit confused here. But I guess I will try it like this. If it doesn't work out, I'm going to replace the internals with that old Sram hub that I showed in an earlier video. But hopefully this is going to work out just fine. So the last thing that I need to do is install a cog. But I find this slit here a bit too open. I can see the ball bearings, so I'm going to put some grease on here. Not sure if this is going to be a good idea. It probably will get worked loose by the ball bearings. Next is dust cap goes on here, and I believe this used sprocket is still good enough. It has a 19 tooth. Now a spacer, and last but not least, the damn struggle for installing this C-clip, or whatever this clip is called. Got it. So I'm busy truing up this wheel, checking the spoke tension and such. And it all looks very acceptable. Good enough for a wheel with a drum brake. So now this wheel is ready to be installed into my Valuas bicycle, and I guess that will be the subject of the next video. So I thought I was finished with assembling the Sachs Torpedo hub, but when I was editing the video I realized that the only thing that could have caused the gap between the drum brake lining and the drum is that Sram cone that I used. And here you can see there is a difference in height between the original cone that's now on the floor and the Sram one. So I'm going to try and assemble this goddamn torpedo hub with the original cone and the stupid cap that sits on top of the spring, and I will do a whole lot of cursing because the spring is pushing the driver up and the driver does not want to sit between the cage with ball bearings, and the same is true for the cone that sits in between the driver. It doesn't want to sit between the ball bearings, and this cap is constantly being pushed up by the spring through the cage with ball bearings. Oh, this will be such a nightmare. But I will get it done. But first I'm going to go for tea. So after lots of profanity I managed to reinstall the driver and the original cone and that stupid copper thingy. And I think the adjustment of the cone is good. So let's see if the gap between the drum brake lining and the drum is now a little bit narrower. First that washer that caused me a whole lot of confusion. Drum brake lining. The gap is actually still rather wide. Maybe this was all for nothing. Yeah, that's the story of my life. Still the cone isn't sticking out, not above this adjustment washer, so it will not sit in this recess. But yeah, I gotta move on. Let's reassemble this thing and then really end this shit show. It's probably too tight. Well, that's good enough. The end.